Well, okay, great. I'm going to get started. So my name is Lee Howard. I'm a senior vice president at IPv4.global by Hilco Streambank. We are an address broker, but I want to make sure that I'm clear that my goal today is not to get people to convince people to sell addresses or do anything awkward for them. I want to provide people with more information so that people can make the better decisions for their organizations. Our target market for this is members of E&I. E&I is a member-owned nonprofit that does cooperative sourcing, and they're exclusively focused on the education community. That said, I know that we have people from different industries and from around the world, so I'll try to expand that and make it a little bit more applicable to everybody who's here. I have with me, I have Trevor from Lewis and Clark College and Jonathan from Hartwick University. We'll be hearing from them at various points during the presentation. I will say that I don't assume that this is a technical audience, so I will try to keep my content from being too deeply technical. That said, I am kind of deep in the weeds on this as part of my day-to-day job. So feel free to use on the right side of your screen, you'll see the chat function. Feel free to pop questions in there, and we should see that. I may not answer immediately because I'll be mid-sentence or something, but we will try to respond to things as we go along to make sure that we're not losing people as we go. Right next to the chat button or tab, you'll see a handouts tab. You can download these slides from there. You can do that now or anytime during the presentation, and that'll just make it easier for you to follow along in case you get disconnected or something. So yeah, that said, let's have some fun with numbers. So we're talking about IP addressing, and IP addresses are, well, they're numbers. And so people use names, like I've got the example here, www.ipv4.global. That's our URL. That's how you find our website is www.ipv4.global. Computers, phones, tablets, devices like that use numbers, not names. Names are just a handy way for humans to remember things. So those numbers might look like 23.185.0.4 in IPv4. That's Internet Protocol version 4. Or they might in IPv6 look like 2620:12A:8001:4. Those are just different addresses for the same that provide a mapping to the same name that is www.ipv4.global. This is really just the widgets. This is, it doesn't really matter from the perspective of somebody who's looking to begin thinking about or considering whether doing something in renumbering or this address market is important to them. But it's a little bit of a way to show that, give some context for what we're talking about. These addresses, the 23.185.0.4, which I mentioned is IPv4, Internet Protocol version 4. Those are allocated in groups or of ranges of powers of 2. Those powers of 2 are 256, 512, 1024, 65536, for instance. The protocol it's a set of rules and vocabulary syntax, just like a language, for how things talk to each other on the internet. And so it defines a possible range of addresses, and it's 4.3 billion possible addresses, which in 1979, 1980, when this protocol was being defined, that would become the internet. That seemed like a lot of devices. There weren't a whole lot of personal computers in 1980. They were mostly mainframes, maybe some mini computers. That seemed like a large possibility. It turns out that now there's 7 billion people who all want to be connected to the internet. They've got their phones, tablets, laptops, game consoles, internet, IoT devices, all of these things, and they all need addresses. So there's some technologies that are used to stretch out the IPv4, the duration, the availability of IPv4, but eventually probably we move to IPv6. That scarcity, as more and more devices connected, led to a market. So that's why there is a market for organizations that have more IP addresses than they need to sell them to organizations that need more addresses than they have. So in the 80s and 90s, there were the early days of what became the internet. We had ARPANET, DARPANET, NSFNet, those networks connected, including lots of organizations, including a lot of colleges, especially those R1 institutions from in those decades that joined the internet in those days. That was great. They got a lot of addresses, and a lot of those got a largish block of addresses of 65,536 addresses. So if you look at the little table on the right, I know it's small. This is downloadable from a website. You can see the sort of second or third light blue bar shows a /16 is called, was a class B block, and that's 6/16 means 65,536 addresses. There's over 1,000 U.S. schools that have a /16 or more, and that's kind of a big deal because that block of addresses are worth about $3.2 million US dollars. That's a lot of money, especially to smaller schools that may only have a few thousand students. That's a lot of addresses that could be sold, and that's why this market has come about, and why there's potential revenue for schools in this market now. I am going to be focusing on Aaron for this presentation because I was thinking about the E&I members, but let me come back to what the specifics there, and I can talk more about the other regions if people want me to. So in the earliest days, or I guess not in the earliest days, back when registries had addresses, there was a sort of a central registry that was IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. And they gave addresses to the regional internet registries. And there's basically one per continent. ARIN for North America, RIPE NCC for Europe, APNIC for Asia Pacific, LACNIC for Latin America, Caribbean, and you could probably figure out AFRINIC serves Africa. Then there were also, in those earliest days, legacy allocations. And those are allocations made, in some cases, directly from IANA, or even the precursors to IANA, John Postel with his famous spiral notebook, writing down MIT has this block of 16 million addresses. And those are legacy addresses. In the ARIN region, that means addresses allocated before, which is North America, addresses allocated before, see it here, December 22nd, 1997, when ARIN was founded. And ARIN treats those resources, those addresses, slightly differently. If you sign a contract with ARIN to maintain services, you can update WHOIS. You can use RPKI, which is routing security, to protect yourself, and ARIN will make sure that that you control those addresses. ARIN won't be able to come back and no matter what policy the community passes in the future, they can't reclaim those addresses. Those are protected from them. It's probably unlikely that there would ever be a policy allowing ARIN to reclaim addresses in that way, because colleges and universities are also members of the ARIN community, and the policies are driven by the public. So people would come in and say, let's not do that. But it's worth noting that normalizing a relationship with ARIN can protect you just on that corner case. It's also, without a contract, ARIN will not let you use RPKI, that routing security. They haven't done a vetting of the organization to make sure that the organization that says who they are is actually the right organization. And so they won't generate the digital certificate that prevents hijacking. They also won't allow address transfers. So you can't sell the addresses while they're in legacy status unless the entire organization is acquired. So if an institution is being purchased by another institute or is merging with another institution, that vetting doesn't have to be updated with the contract, but they will double check. Sometimes ARIN, let me go through the process a little bit further actually. The process for doing the transfer, and I've sort of abbreviated it here. This is kind of deep in the weeds on process, but I wanted to show that it's pretty simple. In the ARIN region, buyer and seller match, agree on terms, and then the seller opens a ticket with ARIN. That ticket is 4 questions. Are the recipient and source, the buyer and seller, both in the ARIN region, or are they in different regions? Are you the buyer or the seller? Is this a reorg or a purchase like that, or a M&A? And then, is there anybody else involved in the process? Then you identify which block, which addresses you're talking about, who owns them, who they're going to. It's very, very simple, but it's sometimes people get a little alarmed about it. ARIN does, the next step in the process is ARIN has you pay a transfer fee. That transfer fee is, I'll show it later, but it's $550 right now. Seller pays that, gets added to their ticket. ARIN might ask for documentation about the organization. That documentation could be articles of incorporation that have been filed with the Secretary of State or the Department of Commerce or whatever it is in the state. It might be a certificate of good standing. Those kinds of corporate paperwork to show this is actually the organization that is responsible for these addresses. And the final step on the seller side is an officer acknowledgement, and it has to be signed and notarized. And this is a document that says that an officer of the organization, somebody who's actually responsible for the corporate affairs of the organization, knows that there's an asset being transferred away from the organization, and that they're aware of that. That's important to Aaron because they really want to make sure that there isn't some, you know, minor functionary in the mailroom or something who is transferring millions of dollars worth of assets away from an organization. That's part of what they're doing there, is trying to protect themselves and make sure that somebody in authority actually said, yes, we know this is happening. On the buyer side, not much more difficult. So agree on terms. That generally the buyer will fund escrow. So the buyer will send the money for the addresses to a third party. Often the broker, could be a bank, could be escrow.com or another service. Buyer opens a ticket, much like the seller. It's very simple. Source in the same region or different regions. Are you the buyer or seller? Do you know who you're buying from? Is this M&A? Is there any and I guess the rest of those are just, are they being is this part of an M&A or partial M&A? And then which block, what addresses? It's Aaron also does add a transfer fee. I'll come back to what those transfer fees are, and it varies by the size of the block. So a smaller block is cheaper in the Aaron transfer fees. I'll come back to that towards the end. And the buyer pays that. And then Aaron will ask for a documentation of need. So Aaron wants to make sure that the addresses are going to be used in a network that's actually going to use them. They're really trying to prevent hoarding or speculation that'll drive up costs for other networks coming on the internet. And so they're going to ask for, how are you going to use these addresses? Why do you need them? And some kind of documentation. Sometimes that's just showing your server logs or your DHCP or your network plans, something to show that this is a real organization here. It's typically not crazy hard, but it does require, especially for a company that's been keeping good records, but it's a little bit of work, and sometimes people have to spend a little bit of time putting that documentation together. You don't need a broker. I sort of, I almost hate to say that, but Aaron is very clear, and so I want to be clear that you don't need a broker to complete a sale or a transfer. Aaron calls them specified transfer facilitators because they like big acronyms and specialized jargon. But you don't need a broker. You might want a broker. You might want a broker to help you find a buyer for your addresses. You might want a broker to help you to provide advice on pricing. Broker is often the escrow agent, and you may want a little help to go through those clicks in opening that ticket on the previous step. Aaron used to list dozens, maybe 100 brokers on their site, specified registered facilitators, and they got some complaints. And they got a number of complaints saying, why are you listing people here who are misrepresenting the market, who are lying to their customers, and who are just not providing any help whatsoever? So Aaron said, well, okay, let's see what we can do about that. And last year, 2023, they came up with the Qualified Facilitator Program. And so there were some fairly strict requirements there. You have the qualified facilitators. These are brokers who will put up a bond and say that they understand Aaron's processes, that they understand the transfer market, that they've done background checks on their staff, and if they don't do a diligent vetting and something happens, they'll back up Aaron in any lawsuits that result from it. So fairly strenuous requirements there. Last I checked, there were only 8 or 9 qualified facilitators, and of course, IPv4 Global by Hilco Stream Bank is one of them. So we went through that process. And we're also, as I started to mention earlier, we are a business partner with E&I. So E&I went out to basically the entire market and said, we're looking to source an IPv4 address broker for universities, for E&I members. And we went through a process and we provided a bid that said, and basically their RFP included requirements for all of any RFP by any university in the country. So they've already met the requirements. So any university in North America, basically, I guess in the United States, basically can just adopt the contract that they negotiated. And they beat us up a little bit on price too. So It's a good contract. Anybody who isn't a member and is eligible to be a member should definitely talk to them, or we can help make a referral there. Happy to do that. One of the things that we do, I mentioned providing advice on pricing, is the sort of bottom left of this slide shows recent sales. So we publish every transfer that happens, every sale that happens on our online marketplace at auctions.ipv4.global. We publish the price. We publish the date of the sale where the buyer and seller agreed on price. The block size /17 is that top one. That's 32,768 addresses. Which region the block is currently registered in, and then the final price and the price per address. And by doing this, we're showing how much we're making information available to all parties, so that a buyer can't underbid a seller and sort of give them an unfair price, and vice versa. Sellers can't list crazy prices because people can compare. It's now public information. We wanted the community to have that information. It's really sort of rationalized the market. It's also interesting that even people who aren't involved recite this information because, as far as I know, it's the only public record of address prices. We do have offline transactions. Sometimes we have transfers, parties that don't want to go through our platform or have custom terms that they need to negotiate. Those aren't necessarily published. So there may be transactions outside of this, but those are generally going to be the very large ones. And those are cases where you probably want an advisor anyway. So we provide this kind of pricing information. Trevor from Lewis and Clark, I would love to hear about your experience in the address market. How did you decide that you were going to do something here, and what did it take?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Hey, everybody. My name is Trevor Dodson. I'm the Senior IT Director up at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. We're a small liberal arts college, been around 100 plus years. So I'll speak to a few different things and talk about my experience, and be open to any questions if anybody's got any. I'll try to keep it non-technical, but there might be a couple technical jargon words in there. I'll try to explain what they are. But so yeah, we first started thinking about this process or project about 3 years ago. It's kind of a two-factor perfect storm, if you will. The first one was IPv4 Global started calling on me, which really piqued my interest into understanding that we were sitting on an asset, basically, this huge asset. As a matter of fact, we fell into that category of universities that had the 65,000 addresses under our belts that we owned. We call them public addresses, if you will, publicly routable addresses. We also had a smaller group of addresses that we've retained for networking purposes, but we did have that big group that we got allocated back in the 90s. So there was this huge asset. So through some conversations with IPv4 Global, and we realized we're sitting on this. We didn't need that IPs. In fact, from a technical standpoint, we're better off without them. And brought it up to my boss and went to the CFO and said, hey, if you're ever interested, here's a way that IT can actually, show some revenue or provide revenue for the institution. So piqued the interest of our CFO right away. And the $1 million question, I mean, quite literally the $1 million question, how much are they worth? How much? And that was, that's the part of this, is that you don't really know. It goes up and down. When we started this endeavor 3 years ago, they weren't worth nearly as much as what we had sold them for recently. And when I say recently, I think we're on that list right there in the December timeframe. That looks like our sale. So, and that was significantly more than what it was the first 3 years. So it's a market that ebbs and flows based on supply and demand. I mean, these guys at Hilco are experts in this space, so they could really give more information there than I could. But fortunately for us, things moved slow in higher ed, and it took us some time technically to prepare for the sale. So that actually bode well for us. That was a benefit. So that was how we decided to do it, why we decided to do it. To be honest and frank, I did do some research on IPv4 Global. We are members of Gartner, and I had a Gartner analyst call, and they highly recommended IPv4. They said you can't go wrong. You're in good hands with them as a broker and as handle this process. So that made us really comfortable with choosing them as our broker. And then I think I mentioned they called me quite a bit. So And then so really all we had to do to prepare our network was we had to change those 65,000 addresses. It sounds like a lot of work. It kind of was and it kind of wasn't. Some big swaths of our network you can do handily, and that's what we did. Like we have big DHCP pools, what gives addresses out automatically to all the devices Lee was talking about, internet connected devices, everything from phones to laptops to computers to smart devices, Internet of Things devices that are on our campus, all got IP addresses. And so we made the change there first because I was going to cover the majority. The real work came when we had to change publicly facing systems in our data center, in our server room. And those ones took a little bit more time and energy and more thought. They had to be done during maintenance windows and such. So if anything, I would say that it was the long pole in our tent. But it wasn't impossible. It just takes a little time, a little energy, and we got through it. And then finally, at the last step, what we do is effectively stop advertising that IP space. It's another networking term. So we stop saying that we have it available to the internet. And then at that point is where Hilco comes in and really helps. They say, okay, now we're ready to sell, right? That was our kickoff point. We were prepared as an institution to say, well, we're done with our IPs and we can safely say we're not advertising. Let's go through the process. And that's where, the why have a broker comes into play as well. So for us, it was because we had that large chunk, it was a no-brainer to have the broker the deal. They had contacts, and I won't say the large companies, but they were massive companies, two of them. The first deal didn't go through, and it's because this one massive company didn't have budget. It was weird. It's like, how do they not have budget for this? But they didn't, and they were going to hold off. So a second massive company came in and said, oh, we can buy them. And so having that available, so we didn't have to go to auction, which was really great. So, with the contacts that they have at IPv4 Global and Hilco, they put it together for us. So it was a no-brainer. Having them manage the escrow account, again, no-brainer. Made it super, super simple. I will tell you that Aaron process that he just talked through, that Lee just walked through, I was pleasantly surprised how simple it was. We did a couple of signed docs here and there, and it was a little nerve-wracking hitting that release button to release all those IPs into an escrow account. But we knew we were in good hands, and it was a safe endeavor. The whole transaction, from the point we were ready to the point we were done, was quite honestly one of the easier things I've had to do in my 25-year career. It wasn't difficult, and again, having them there to help us through it was instrumental, and it went really, really well. And so far, so good. And hopefully the new buyer is enjoying those IP addresses.
That's great. Thank you, Trevor. From the time you decided we should start freeing up these addresses so we can sell them until you were able to take them off the internet, stop running, how long did that take?
I had a feeling you were going to ask that. So for us, really long time. If it were a dedicated project, I would indicate probably plan 3 months, 3 to 5 was about how long it really took us to get down. The majority of it being in that data center. Those were the harder ones to deal with because at the time, and again, I'm not trying to be too technical, but in the data center, when you have IP addresses that are internet facing, sometimes you're doing business with vendors in the cloud or something, and they've got to know the new IP address. You've got to change the IP address. So it's a little bit of a coordinated effort to make that happen. So really change windows and maintenance windows inside of your IT group is really where that comes into play a lot. But I think if we were to sit down and really focus, if that was our only focus, it would have been about a 3-month total ordeal. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. I hope you're sticking around so that people can ask questions at the end.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Good. So I talked about price for a bit. Trevor mentioned price, that prices were kind of going up as he was doing his renumbering, and that benefited him. As I said, we publish prices. This is an example of our price card. We republish this every month. One of the interesting things, and this is one of the things you're talking about, is you had this large block of space, and you were renumbering into a smaller space. Errant policy does allow you to get a smaller block of addresses and renumber into that so that you can transfer the entire block. And the reason that's really interesting is sort of, as you can see here, this top blue, I realize the print is very small. This top blue line is the price per address for those largest blocks, those blocks of 65,536 addresses. And that's right now, it's about $50 per address. That's $3.2, 3.76, that's 3.2, $3.3 million US. Compare that to the next size down, a /17, which is 32,000 addresses, and that's more like $34 an address. So it's $1.1 million. But so if you were to take out just a little bit of address space, take out 256 addresses from that 65,000, you're no longer making 3.2 million. You're making 2.2 million because of the difference in per address, because you've broken it up. It's no longer one intact block. So that's very valuable for in that kind of. It's important information to realize. Now, I will say that I have a feeling that in 2024, prices will converge. I don't know whether that means that prices will come up for the medium-sized blocks or go down for those larger blocks, but it seems to me that that is a surprisingly large gap right now. You can see that the small, medium, semi-medium, I don't know, those three clusters of smaller blocks, they're kind of in the same range, and they kind of stay in the same range over time. And so to have that big spread, that big disparity for those largest blocks is surprising. I think they'll reconverge. I don't know exactly how much or what the mechanics will be or how fast. So we shall see. And if somebody's listening to the recording later, it'll be really interesting to have you go back and compare what actually happened. One of the things that we can do is we found that a lot of people were having to do work to find out how they're using their addresses in order to be able to redo that work. People would say, look, I'm not even sure exactly where all those addresses are being used. So we put together a renumbering tool. We worked with a partner, 6Connect, to develop an audit tool that will go through and provides a dozen different ways to look at the network and find out all the different possible ways that there might be a record or utilization of one IP address. So you can find out where are these IP addresses lurking, which will help you then build the plan to renumber. It's available for free download, much more useful for the technical staff who can provide key login information for routers or configuration repositories or SNMP, those kinds of technical devices. But take a look, and happy to talk about that at any great length. Something that we sometimes do too is if somebody says, I know that I have to spend time and money renumbering, providing that renumbering, doing that work, we can potentially advance some funds against the eventual sale. And we want to be able to provide that. It provides flexibility to the organization. If they need to bring in outside consultants or do other kinds of work in order to enable that renumbering to make the block available for sale, we have the ability to help with that. Jonathan from Hartwick, I hope that you have an equally good story to tell us. I'm going to, Emery, I'll come back to your question after we hear from Jonathan.
All right, thank you very much, Lee. Yeah, listening to...
I don't hear you.
How about now? No sound?
Jonathan, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Is it just me? Okay. Other people say they can hear you, so go right ahead. It's just me.
All right. Well, Lee can't hear me, but thanks to him anyway for having me on. Listening to Trevor's story is very similar. I'm from Hartwick College. I'm the director of systems and networks there, and we are also a small liberal arts school who sometime back in, I believe, 1992, applied for and acquired a Class B network. I have to say, over the course of my 9 years at the institution, we've looked at selling our IP addresses a few times, but until recently, the cost of redesigning our network versus the return for selling just didn't seem to make sense. But as was mentioned, those prices came up quite a bit, and we decided to go for it. Also, being honest, the financial landscape facing liberal arts institutions was certainly a motivating factor there as well. Unlike Trevor, however, we did not have sufficient funding to do the network redesign required to make this move and to sell our addresses. Over the course of our existence, we had deployed these IP addresses everywhere, from printers to HVAC systems and elevator consoles. We were just wasting $50 addresses on anything and everything everywhere. And so we knew it was going to take a fair amount of network engineering to pull all that back. So we actually approached IPv4 Global and sold our IP addresses directly to them. And they were able to most of that money, or a lot of that money, to us ahead of time, with an agreement that we would be off in a certain amount of time. That actually ended up being fantastic, because not only were we able to move off of those IP addresses, but we were also able to tackle a lot of network redesign that we had been hoping to do for security reasons, for ease of management. We wanted to implement new technology like zero trust technology, that sort of thing. We just could never afford to, or we could never fit it all in our budget. And so this was a great opportunity. We were able to go to our CFO and say, hey, we're going to get you $3.2 million. Just give us the 0.2 and we'll use that to fix the network. Everything will be great. Everything will be more secure. You'll have $3 million to play with. We'll have $200,000 to redesign our network. It actually came in about half that, all told. And like I said, it ended up being a huge win for the college. I got to say, on the sales side, IPv4 Global was easy to work with. Our account exec, Hank, was always available. They even actually handled much of the ARIN process. I know Trevor said it was easy. It was, I'm not going to say it was hard for us. I did run into an issue where we were selling 65,000 addresses, and at the same time we bought 256 addresses, and they gave me a really hard time justifying the 256 addresses. And I was really tempted to say, well, fine, we'll just keep the $65,000 address, or 65,000 addresses, and you guys can go pound salt. But no, that's I jest. But thankfully, Hank was able to get somebody up from their end on the phone with ARIN, because they clearly have a relationship with them. They handled all the paperwork. They ended up handling ARIN completely for us and just made everything completely easy. So like I said, it was definitely a great project. I'm not going to pretend that the network engineering portion wasn't a lot of work, but really much of that was due to the improvements and the new technology we implemented during it. But in terms of the contract negotiation, the sale itself, IPv4 Global was a great partner, and they really made it easy.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I do want to come back to the question I said we'd get back to. Elizabeth Briley asked in the chat, at what point in the process is the price locked in? So if you're using the online marketplace, generally prices are listed at a requested price, an asking price. We can list prices both either as an auction, and so it'll be a starting price for bids to go up from, or as a buy now, where the first person to come along and say, I'll buy it at that price, could buy it. And once they do, that's the agreement. The price is set in at that price. We, of course, check with sellers to say, what price are you looking for? Which way would you like to go? In private transactions, we ask for, what are you looking for? And we'll provide advice. We'll go back and forth with potential buyers until we have an agreement. Once we have an agreement in, a verbal agreement, then we'll actually put out a contract and say, let's make sure we've got signatures on that. Generally, once we have a verbal agreement, I don't think we've ever had anybody say, no, I've changed my mind. We're not going to pay that much. We'll pay this much. We've had people get cold feet and say, we need to stall for a few weeks because of fiscal year or timing or budget approvals, but that kind of work. So that's when the price is locked in. I did say earlier that I would talk about ARIN's fees. Typically, brokers charge, depending on the broker and the size of the block, something like 2 to 10% of the commission of the total price. Sometimes it's the seller, sometimes it's the buyer, sometimes it's both sides. Mostly, it's for us, almost always the seller who pays it, and generally we just withhold the commission from the escrow being transferred. And then Aaron does have an annual fee for anybody holding addresses with a contract with Aaron. And the fee is $4,000 for a /16 or larger than /18, up to and including /16. By the way, these terms, again, the slash whatever, this is sort of the technical jargon that we network engineers use to describe these block sizes. The larger the number after the slash, the fewer addresses there are on the block. It's not necessarily intuitive, but it's because the number of addresses is how many devices could be numbered out of it. And the number behind the slash is how large the network number is. So it's sort of the reverse of the number of devices. So for many organizations, that $4,000 a year is the annual, the carrying cost for Aaron in order to manage that rate. The other registries have different fees, and we do publish those on our online site. Or, of course, you can go to the regional registry in question and just look up their fees. On the seller side, so the transfer fees, that was the holding price, the annual membership fee. Seller pays at Aaron a flat $550 fee. The buyer pays a variable fee depending on the size of the block. So for the very smallest blocks that we do, it's $187.50. So that's how much the buyer would pay to transfer. For a full /16, it's $6,000. Sounds like a lot, but on a purchase of $3.2 million, it's not that much. One of the things I do always advise buyers is if you have to go through a purchasing process, like a PO process, definitely get that PO signed and include approval on that transfer fee, because you don't want to have to go back and go through the PO process again. It does vary, of course, by registry. RIPE has no transfer fees. They have different annual holding fees, and then, of course, the other registries have their own fees. And again, those are kind of easy to look up anywhere you go to. One of the questions I often get asked is, what about IPv6? I encourage everyone to deploy IPv6. I think one of the best reasons now is that Amazon Web Services is charging, they say 0.005 cents per hour per IPv4 address, which works out to something like, I think it's $43, not $34 per year per IPv4 address. And that may turn into real money, especially we're seeing prices around $34, $40 an address. And that's for a one-time purchase. And so it may be, for a lot of people, more cost-effective to buy a block of addresses to use on Amazon using the Bring Your Own IP service. And that's just one example. There's lots of other reasons to deploy IPv6. I will say transfers are not allowed in IPv6, and that's both because there's no policy allowing it, but also there's 340 billion IPv6 addresses. We're nowhere near a scarcity that would drive a market. So there's no market, there's no reason to do it. Of course, if two organizations are merging or one's acquiring another and the acquired organization has IPv6 addresses, Errors isn't going to make you go renumber. That is allowed under M&A. I wanted to compare a little bit about the transfer policies in the other regions between North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, Latin America. That's RIPE, that's Aaron RIPE, APNIC, and LACNIC. You can transfer addresses between any of those regions essentially freely. The processes are slightly different. LACNIC is significantly slower than the other three, but we know those processes very well. We've done them many times, maybe thousands of times. But the policies do allow transfers between those different regions. In Africa, AFRA-NIC policy allows for transfers within the region, so from somebody in the region to somebody else in the region. They also allow transfer from somebody in the region to somebody. AFRA-NIC policy allows transfers also from somebody outside the region to somebody inside the region. So they will allow inbound transfers. However, the other registries say, no, we're not going to allow one-way transfers that allow another region to bring addresses away from us without the possibility of reciprocity. So because of that, inter-RIR transfers to and from AFRA-NIC are essentially not allowed. Otherwise, inter-region is perfectly fine. I'm going to pause for a minute. We're at 40 minutes, and I want to see if people have other questions they'd like to talk about. I can bring up a few other things that sometimes come up, but I want to give people a chance to ask questions in the chat. Would be ideal. And as we're giving people a chance, another question that sometimes comes up for us is leasing. And there is a leasing market. Some organizations want to lease addresses for various reasons. Now, prices for leasing, so if prices to buy addresses are $35 to $50 per address, depending on the size of the block, leasing prices are more like $3, $4, maybe $5 an address per year. So it takes a long time to make the same amount of money on a lease that you would on a sale. Then again, that's a reason you might want to, if you need addresses, you might prefer to lease, especially on the long term, because that spreads your costs out over a longer period of time. Certainly, there are organizations that lease addresses because they're going to do something less savory with them, and the policies are a little bit mixed on when leasing is allowed. For the most part, if you have addresses, you're allowed to lease them out, but you can't use those leases as justification for additional addresses. The exception there is in the RIPE region, which is Europe. I should be clear, Europe and Middle East. And in that region, they do not have a needs justification process except for transfers from a region that requires that. So it's less of an issue in Europe. And some of those, and so there's a whole lot of different reasons why people do that. So we do some leasing. We'll help facilitate that as well, provide advice. But the dollars aren't necessarily as exciting there. Peter asks, other than renumbering or the technical prep, how long does the process take? So if you don't need to renumber, or if you already have and the block is just sitting intact, generally from the time you say, hi, IPv4.global, we'd like to sell these addresses, to the time you get money, generally it's going to be something like 3 to maybe 8 weeks. Sort of depends on if you require custom terms, if you have lawyers that need to do a lot of back and forth on contract work, if you're willing to just say, you know what, the online platform is great, let's just post them on the marketplace and see who buys, then we may find a buyer for you in as little as a week or so. And then the transfer process from the time buyer and seller have agreed on a price is 3 to 5 weeks. And that's it's variable. Sometimes we have certainly had transfers happen in just a day or two. And we've had other transfers take months. And that sort of varies a lot on partly the registry, but mostly it's how responsive the parties are. So one of the big sticking points that we see is buyers take a long time to, if you're trying to send a wire for $3.2 million, that may not happen overnight after you signed a contract. So that can take a little while. But once we've actually begun the transfer process, it's generally fairly quick. A week is realistic from the time the transfer process begins. Again, except in LACNIC, where they have specific requirements like circulating transfer documents requiring actual wet ink signatures. They have to have the originals. Those kinds of processes will slow things down a bit, and so they can be much slower there. Good question. I like that. Other questions? Sometimes when talking with people at universities, they ask, is this going to affect our reputation if the organization that we sell to does something malicious with those addresses, sends spam, attacks somebody else, or is just an unsavory kind of site? Is that going to affect us? And I always say the answer is no, because without some pretty significant sleuthing, nobody knows that the addresses used to belong to you. Once they're transferred to the recipient, every public record says the recipient owns them. Maybe a little bit more risk with something like leasing, but not with the transfer. Many transferees, recipients, would like to see that the addresses have not been used for spam before. So we check multiple reputation block lists for almost all of our listings to make sure that the addresses are clean. There's no negative reputation information that might make it harder for them to use the addresses for whatever purpose they can use it for. So that comes up from time to time. I'm looking around to see if anybody else has anything else they'd like to talk about. Difficult questions, tricky. I kind of threw a lot of information out there, and I really appreciate that people have made time to listen to this. I hope it's been useful. I hope that people are thinking about how this market might be useful to them, might be able to sell addresses they hadn't thought about. Frequently, we get speaking to somebody at an organization that might want to sell addresses, and and we need to get engaged and talk to the people who have to do a little bit of work, like the people on this call, in order to make the addresses available. So Mitesh Patel says, I have a /23 in APNIC. Can I sell it? So /23 is 512 addresses. And the general answer is yes. The more detailed answer is APNIC, it depends on a couple of minor factors. APNIC requires that you hold the addresses. If the last large allocation that APNIC got from IANA was from the 103 network, the 103/8 block. So if your address starts with 103, they require that you hold it for at least 5 years before you can transfer it. Otherwise, it depends slightly on which actual country you're in Asia Pacific region, because some of the countries in the region, or some of the economic areas in the region have limitations on whether you can transfer addresses out of them. For instance, I know off the top of my head that KRNIC, the National Internet Registry for Korea, does not allow outbound transfers. In general, yes, it's allowed. I know that I have seen transfers from IRIN in India. So that I know that I've seen transfers, especially between organizations within the country. I'd have to check off the top of my head. I think they're allowed outbound, but I haven't actually checked that policy in recent memory. And happy to look it up and help you with that. Again, that's exactly the sort of thing we love to do. Great question. I look forward to more of those. So I've left my email address on the screen so that anybody can reach out to me. Any questions that you were shy about asking in the chat, or specific questions that are specific to you and to your company or organization, please feel free to send me email. I try to get to all of my email every day, and sometimes I get a little overwhelmed, but I will also happily engage the right people from our team to help you out. And with that, again, I want to thank everybody for your time. I thank you for spending some time with us today. I hope it's been helpful. You can also certainly use that email address to send me notes and say, here's what else I'd like to see the next time you do a webinar. There are other webinars that we can do for you. Thank you so much.